No fire, no nurse, no cry. They told me my son simply stopped breathing, but someone had locked the cold inside this room.
Your Grace, the bundle was moving. What did you say?
You have no authority here. The child is Edward Ashford, alive, and your lies end tonight.
The nursery was cold the night Evangeline's son stopped breathing. No fire had been lit, no nurse remained in the room, and the physician who signed the death record, the one who swore little Edward simply failed to thrive, was found 6 months later with a pocket full of gold coins bearing the Ashford family seal. Someone had paid to keep that nursery cold. Someone had paid to keep that door locked. And now, the most feared Duke in England had arrived at her door, and he already knew. Welcome to the Royal Duke Diaries, where every love story carries a secret worth dying for. Stay close. This one will change everything you think you know. England, at 1873. The manor of Ashford Park had a particular kind of silence that lived in its walls. Not the peaceful silence of an evening, not the comfortable silence of a house at rest, but the kind of silence that followed catastrophic loss. The kind that settled into corners and refused, no matter what was done to dislodge it, to leave. Evangeline Ashford had learned to carry it with her. She stood in the nursery doorway on a Thursday morning in October, the same way she had stood every Thursday morning for the past 6 months, her fingers resting against the cold brass handle, her breath coming steady and controlled the way it always did when she was fighting herself. The room was exactly as it had been the night Edward died. She had not allowed a single thing to be moved. The white lace blanket still draped the cradle's edge. The carved oak rocker sat at its habitual angle. The small silver rattle on the windowsill that had never been shaken by hands old enough to hold it caught the thin morning light and glinted softly, a small, bright thing in a room full of stillness. He had only been 3 months and 4 days when they found him. 3 months and 4 days. And Evangeline had spent the 6 months since in a grief so quiet it had started to look, from the outside, like composure. She was not composed. She was surviving. There was a difference. Your Grace. Marin, her lady's maid, appeared at her elbow with her hands folded and her face carefully neutral. Lord Philip has requested your presence in the East drawing room. He says it is urgent. Evangeline let her gaze travel one final time over the nursery, the cradle, the rattle, the window with its pale autumn light, before she pulled the door gently closed. Tell him I will be down in 10 minutes, she said. She was there at 8. Lord Philip Ashford had the look of a man who had always expected to be important and had only recently been given the occasion. He was 41, with Edmund's coloring but none of Edmund's warmth, and since inheriting the Ashford dukedom 2 months after Edward's death, he had occupied every room in this house like a man reclaiming stolen territory. He was standing at the fireplace when Evangeline entered. He turned with that particular expression he had perfected over 6 months, polite on the surface, something considerably colder running underneath. Evangeline. He gestured to the chair opposite him as though it were his invitation to give. Sit, please, she sat. But she arranged herself the way a duchess sat, straight-spined, deliberate, hands quiet in her lap and gaze steady on his face. I've received word from London, Philip said, moving to the sideboard to pour himself a brandy he did not offer to share. The King's Council has appointed an investigator to review the Ashford estate accounts and the succession records. He paused, swirling the glass. Duke Roderic Vossler. Evangeline had heard that name before. Every person in England had heard that name. Duke Roderic Vossler was not the kind of man you spoke of casually. He was the kind of man who came up in conversations that other conversations stopped for. I am 34 years old, unmarried, close enough to the King's inner circle to have shaped policy across 3 parliamentary sessions, and precise enough in his methods that 4 of England's most powerful lords had resigned their positions rather than submit to his review. He had a reputation for finding things that were meant to stay buried. When will he arrive? She asked. Tomorrow morning. Philip set his glass down. I expect you to be cooperative and unobtrusive, Evangeline. This is an audit of records, nothing more. He will review the accounts, confirm the succession, and depart. His eyes settled on hers with the quality of instruction dressed as reassurance. There is nothing here that requires your involvement. She held his gaze a beat longer than necessary. "Of course," she said quietly. She left the room with her spine straight and her pulse hammering in her throat, because something in the way Philip had said nothing here that requires your involvement had not sounded like comfort. It sounded like a warning. That night, Evangeline sat at her writing desk with a single candle burning and the document she had been maintaining for 6 weeks spread before her. It was not a letter to anyone. Not yet. It was a record. A careful, private accounting of the things that had begun in the months following Edward's death to feel not merely like grief's distortions, but like something more deliberate. Clara Voss, the nursery nurse. Dismissed the night of June the 14th, not the morning after Edward's death, the night before. Evangeline had been too devastated in those first weeks to question the timing. By the time the numbness had worn thin enough for her to wonder, Clara was gone from the manor entirely. She had asked Philip about it once, in the early weeks, and he had looked at her with such studied sympathy it had felt obscene. Grief does things to memory, Evangeline. Allow yourself to grieve rather than searching for explanations that will only prolong your pain. She had not asked again, but she had written it down. The physician, Dr. Harland. He had signed the death record as sudden infant fever. She had been present when he examined Edward's still form, and even through the shaking of her hands, even through the collapse of her world, she had registered something in his manner, a brisk efficiency, a particular absence of surprise, that had troubled her and then been subsumed by everything else. He had left England the following month, Edinburgh, allegedly, and the nursery fire had been lit every evening since Edward's birth. Evangeline had personally instructed Mrs. Graves, the housekeeper, to ensure it burned by 7 each night without exception. She had a memory, sharp, impossible to dismiss, of going to the nursery at 9 o'clock that night, of feeling the warmth from the corridor even before she opened the door, of finding Edward sleeping peacefully in a room soft with firelight. By midnight, he was gone, and the fireplace had been cold. Not dying, not embers. Cold, as though no flame had existed in it that evening at all. She closed her record and pressed it flat beneath a heavy volume of botanical illustrations. Tomorrow, the most dangerous man in England is coming to this house, and Evangeline Ashford was beginning to think that might be the first truly fortunate thing that had happened in 6 months. Duke Roderic Vossler arrived at Ashford Park the following morning in a black traveling carriage with no crest and no announcement. Evangeline had not intended to watch his arrival. She had meant to be in the library, reviewing correspondence with the appearance of industrious calm, presenting the cooperative and unobtrusive widow Philip had instructed her to be. But she found herself at the upper landing window instead. The carriage door opened. He stepped down without waiting for assistance, and even from above, even through glass and October light and the measured distance of the drive, Evangeline felt the quality of the air alter. Roderic Vossler was tall, dark-haired. He wore a charcoal coat that fit him with the precision of something tailored for authority rather than fashion, and he moved across the gravel with the unhurried certainty of a man who had never in his life needed to hurry, because the world had always arranged itself around his pace. He did not look up at the house immediately. He looked at the drive first, then the front steps, and then he tilted his chin very slightly, scanning upward, and Evangeline had exactly 2 seconds to step back from the window before his gaze would have found her at the landing. She stepped back. Her heart was doing something she did not examine closely. She did not formally meet him until luncheon. Philip had arranged a full presentation, silver service, crystal, the elaborate performance of an estate in excellent order. Roderic sat to Philip's right. Evangeline sat opposite, at the position assigned to her since Edmund's death, technically the position of honor, practically the position of a woman being aesthetically managed in her own home. She studied Roderic Vossler across the dining table and found him almost entirely impossible to read. He was handsome the way certain dangerous things were handsome. Dark hair, gray eyes with the quality of something forged rather than inherited, a jaw the candlelight fell across like stone. He spoke rarely during the meal, answered Philip's conversation with the economy, ate with the composed efficiency of a man for whom meals were logistical requirements rather than social pleasures. But twice during that luncheon, his gaze moved from Philip's face to hers. Not the polite acknowledgement of a guest noting his hostess. Something slower. Something that traveled across her face with the calm precision of a man reading a document he had not yet fully decided the meaning of. The second time it happened, Evangeline did not look away. Neither did he. It lasted perhaps 5 seconds, long enough to be notable. Long enough for Lord Reginald Hertford, the neighboring Lord Philip had invited as a strategic buffer, to notice the exchange and clear his throat with unnecessary volume. Hertford was a pleasant man in his late 40s who had been aggressively solicitous of Evangeline since Edmund's death, in the way of men who viewed widows as problems awaiting resolution. He turned his attention toward her now with the warm familiarity he had been deploying for months. "You are looking very well, Evangeline," Hertford said, with the comfortable use of her given name she had never granted him. "The estate suits you, even in these difficult months." She offered him the mild, practiced smile of a woman who had been deflecting men like Hertford for her entire adult life. "You are kind, Lord Hertford." Across the table, Roderic's attention, which had returned to his food, went very still. He did not look up. His fork continued its movement. But something in the set of his jaw shifted, a small, controlled tightening, barely perceptible, that Evangeline registered with the peripheral acuity she had developed for noticing things that were not meant to be noticed. She looked at her own plate and did not smile. After luncheon, Philip escorted Roderic to the estate office for the formal review of records. Hertford lingered in the corridor, managing to intercept Evangeline as she made her way toward the garden. He walked beside her uninvited, making conversation about the autumn planting and the hunting season and a dozen other things she had no interest in, until she reached the garden path and he was forced to stop at the gravel's edge in his unsuitable London shoes. "I hope you know," he said, dropping his voice to the register men used when they believed they were being significant, "that I remain, as always, available to you, Evangeline. Whatever you might need." "You are very generous, Lord Hertford," she said pleasantly. "Good afternoon." She walked away. She was barely 10 steps along the path when she heard another set of footsteps on the gravel behind her, heavier, more deliberate, and she turned to find that Roderic Vossler had come through the side door from the house and was walking toward Hertford with the measured authority of a man who had somewhere specific to be. "Hertford." His voice was level and quiet. "The estate records will require the witness signature of any landholders with adjacent properties. I'll need an hour of your time this afternoon." Hertford straightened with the instinctive response of a man being addressed by someone he recognized as more powerful. "Of course, Duke Vossler, whenever you require it. Now would be most convenient." Hertford was redirected into the house. Roderic watched him go and then, very briefly, without particular emphasis, he glanced toward the garden where Evangeline stood on the path. Their eyes met for 1 second. He turned and went inside. She stood in the October garden and pressed her lips together very carefully. The garden bench beside the old oak had been Edmund's gift the summer they were married. She sat on it in the October cold and let the air settle around her, and she was perhaps 20 minutes into the particular quiet of a woman thinking very hard about several things at once, when footsteps came along the gravel path. She opened her eyes. Roderic Vossler was approaching with the directness of a man for whom a walk in a garden had never been casual. He stopped at a respectful distance. "Your Grace." Duke Vossler. She did not stand. She was the Duchess of this estate by marriage and grief and 6 months of survival, and she would not rise for a visitor in her own garden. He seemed to find this neither offensive nor remarkable. He simply looked at her, unhurried, precise, with something in his eyes that was not unkind, and she had the vertiginous sense that he saw considerably more than most people took the trouble to observe. "Lord Philip tells me your son died in June," he said. The directness would have been brutal from anyone else. From him it was different, honest, almost respectful in its refusal to soften the edge of a hard thing. "Yes," she said. "I am sorry." She looked at him carefully. "Are you?" The corner of his mouth shifted, not quite a smile, something more considered. "I am not in the habit of offering false condolences, Your Grace. I find it wasteful." She held his gaze. "What are you in the habit of, Duke Vossler?" "The truth," he said simply. "It tends to be more useful." He held her gaze a moment longer. Then, with a brief and formal inclination of his head, "I will not take more of your afternoon." He turned and walked back toward the house. Evangeline sat perfectly still and watched him go. And for the first time in 6 months, something other than grief moved through her chest. That evening, after supper, Roderic returned to the estate office. He told Philip he needed to continue reviewing the inheritance documentation. Philip accepted this with the contained satisfaction of a man who believed the documentation was immaculate. Roderic was not reviewing the documentation. He was thinking about a nursery nurse dismissed the night before an infant's death. He pulled the household staff records and found the entry. Clara Voss, nursery nurse, dismissed June 14th. Cause, dereliction of duty. He looked at that entry for a long time. Then he turned to the physician records in the same period. Dr. M. Harland had attended the infant Ashford, had signed the death record with the efficiency of a man familiar with the form, had received a payment of £40 entered in the accounts as household maintenance, recorded on June 16th. The Crown's medical registry listed Dr. Harland's registration transfer to Edinburgh as July 8th, under a slightly altered spelling of his surname. Roderic wrote that down. Then he turned through the estate ledger to the months that followed, and found what he had not been looking for, which was always, in his experience, where the important things lived. 3 entries, monthly, July, August, September, each for a modest sum. Each is recorded as Northern Property Maintenance. The Ashford estate had no northern properties. He turned the ledger page and found the notation. Paid to the Coaching Inn, Kettlemore, North Yorkshire. He closed the ledger. He sat in Edmund Ashford's chair in Edmund Ashford's study in the deep quiet of midnight, and he thought about a woman on a garden bench who had not stood for him, and grey eyes that looked at the world with the careful steadiness of someone who had been waiting for 6 months for someone to ask the right question. He thought about Hertford in the corridor, leaning close, using her given name. He thought about several things that were not relevant to his official mandate. He was self-aware enough to recognize the danger of those thoughts. He was honest enough, with himself, at least, to understand they were not going away. He opened his private ledger and wrote, Yorkshire, first opportunity. Then he wrote, beneath it, she already knows something is wrong. She has been waiting for someone to believe her. He looked at that line for a long time. Then he added, I believe her. The following morning was a quiet devastation. Evangeline had not slept. She had lain in the enormous bed that had been hers alone since Edmund died, and stared at the ceiling and assembled and reassembled the same pieces she had been assembling for 6 months, and they still did not make a shape she could live with. By 6, she was dressed and in the corridor, and she had only made it as far as the nursery door before her feet stopped. She pressed her palm flat against the wood, not praying exactly, not in any form she had been taught, but the gesture of a woman with nowhere else to send the thing that lived in her chest. I don't know what happened, she said quietly, to the door, to the room behind it, to the 6 months of terrible silence she had been keeping. But I am going to find out. I promise you. You will not be looking alone. She turned sharply. Roderic stood at the far end of the corridor. He had come from his room and was not yet fully dressed for the day. His coat was over one arm, his collar open, his dark hair slightly less ordered than it would be by breakfast, as though he had heard her voice and moved toward it without pausing to prepare himself. He looked at her across the corridor's length. You have my word, he said. Something broke open in Evangeline's chest, not painfully. The way ice broke in spring, the release of something that had been held too tightly for too long. She pressed her lips together and nodded, because it was several seconds before she trusted herself to speak without her voice failing her entirely. I found something, she finally managed. Last night in Edmund's private study. He gave me the key months ago. I never used it. She moved toward him. There are letters, Roderic. Letters Edmund wrote in the weeks before he died. He was suspicious of Philip. He was investigating the estate accounts himself. She paused at the closed nursery door, her palm still warm from where it had rested against the wood. He knew something was wrong. He wrote it down. Roderic's grey eyes held hers steadily. Show me, he said. They read the letters together in Edmund's small, tobacco-scented study. With morning light coming through the single east window and Roderic's shoulder close enough to hers that she was aware of it with a peripheral attention she could not quite extinguish. Edmund's handwriting was familiar and heartbreaking. His voice in the letters was clear and frightened, the voice of a man who had loved his son, who had accepted a death he didn't understand, and who had, in the final weeks of his life, begun to pull at threads. The letters were addressed to a solicitor in London, a different man from the one Philip used. In the third letter, Edmund had written, I have reason to believe the records concerning Edward's death have been altered. I have also discovered that Philip made certain estate succession arrangements several months before Edward died. I intend to present this matter to the Crown's Counsel on my return to London next Thursday. He died on Tuesday. He had been due to travel Thursday. Roderic read that passage twice, Then he set the letter flat on the desk, and the silence in the study had a quality that felt like something dropping from a great height. "Philip didn't just remove your son from the succession," Roderic said. He was looking at the letter, not at her, and his voice was very controlled. But she had been watching this man for 2 days now, and she could see the control, could see the effort of it. "He killed your husband." Evangeline had believed herself past shock. She discovered she was not. She placed both hands flat on the desk because the room had shifted, and she needed something solid beneath her palms. Roderic's hand covered hers, not gently, not hesitantly, with the absolute certainty of a man who had made a decision without deliberating. She looked down at his hand on hers. She looked up at his face. He was watching her, and there was nothing professionally neutral in his expression. There was something that moved, something that had been decided. "I am going to need you to continue behaving exactly as you have been," he said. His voice was very quiet. "For the next 24 hours, Philip must see nothing different. Can you do that?" She turned her hand under his and gripped it. "Yes," she said. His fingers closed around hers and held, for 3 seconds, 4, long enough to be deliberate. And then he released her hand and stood and became again the controlled, unreadable Duke Vossler who had stepped out of a carriage 2 days ago. Except that she had seen behind that now, and some things, once seen, declined to unsee themselves. That afternoon, Philip summoned her to the east drawing room. She went. She was composed, cooperative, unobtrusive, exactly as instructed. He had papers for her. Transfer documents, he explained pleasantly, to formalize certain aspects of the estate's succession and clarify her position going forward. She read every line. The documents were designed to strip away her remaining legal claim on the Ashford estate, to remove her from any authority over the accounts, to bind her future actions regarding the succession to terms that would, once signed, make any challenge she raised inadmissible. They were beautifully constructed. She could see the skill in them, the legal precision, the careful language that presented itself as protective while functioning as a cage. If she signed these, Philip would be untouchable. She picked up the pen. She set it down. "I will need to review these with my solicitor before signing," she said pleasantly. "Edmund always encouraged me to consult Mr. Whitmore in London on formal documents. I am certain you understand." Philip's expression did not change. "Of course," he said smoothly. "There is no urgency." He was lying. She could see it in the very smoothness of it. She thanked him warmly and left the room. In the corridor, out of his sight, she exhaled once, slow and controlled, and then she went to find Roderic. She found him coming out of the estate office with his ledger in hand and the particular look of a man who had found something. She told him about the documents. He listened without moving. When she finished, his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "He's accelerating," he said. "He knows I'm here, and he's trying to close the remaining gaps in his position before I identify the irregularities." He paused. "He cannot know how much we already have. Can you stop it? I can do considerably more than stop it." He looked at her directly. "I also sent a letter this morning to a coaching inn in Yorkshire, the Kettlemore Inn. Monthly payments from the Ashford accounts have been going there since July." His voice was measured and quiet. "There is someone at that inn, Evangeline. Someone Philip has been paying to maintain." She felt the blood leave her face and return all at once. "I need to speak with Clara Voss," she said. "The nurse. You said she's still in the village." "She is." He looked at her steadily. "I thought you might wish to come with me." The question, simple as it was, undid something in her. The fact that he had asked, that he had brought it to her rather than simply acting, that he had made space for her in the pursuit of her own truth. "Yes," she said, "now." They rode to the village in his carriage, without informing Philip. The coaching roads were cold, and the trees had gone to rust and gold, and Evangeline sat across from Roderic and tried not to think too clearly about the specific quality of his attention when it was directed at her. "The nurse," she said. "Philip told me she was dismissed for dereliction, that she had left her post without permission." "She was dismissed the night before your son died," Roderic said. "Not for any documented disciplinary reason. Dismissed and paid 2 months' wages in cash, according to a notation in the household cash book that most people would not have thought to cross-reference with the dismissal record." He paused. "Someone was thorough, but thoroughness, in my experience, always leaves more evidence than nothing. What else did you find?" He looked at her. "Do you want all of it at once?" She held his gaze. "I want all of it." Something in his expression shifted, the smallest movement, as though something he had expected her to decline had been offered back to him instead. "Dr. Harland left England in July," he said. under a slightly different name. He received £40 from the Ashford estate accounts on June 16th, the day after your son's death record was filed. He said it without softening it, exactly as she had asked. He is not practicing under his own name. The carriage rocked. The trees passed. Roderic, she said. Yes, I am not going to fall apart. He looked at her for a moment. I know, he said quietly. I haven't been protecting you from the truth. I've been assembling it in order so it makes sense when it arrives. She looked at him across the rocking carriage. In order so it makes sense. As though the truth were a gift that deserved proper wrapping. As though she deserved to receive it whole rather than in fragments. She looked out the window because the alternative was looking at him, and what she was beginning to feel when she looked at him was something she had not yet found the correct container for. Clara Voss lived behind the laundry at the village's edge. A careful, quiet woman in her 40s with frightened eyes and the stillness of someone who had been carrying something unmanageable for 6 months. She went white when she opened the door and found Evangeline on her step. Your Grace, we are not here to cause you harm. Evangeline kept her voice very gentle. I only want to understand what happened. Clara's eyes moved to Roderic. Fear traveled across her face at the recognition of who he was. You are safe, Roderic said, and his voice, which had been measured and cool throughout the journey, carried something deliberate in that moment, something that reached down. Whatever you tell us remains between us until we have cause to proceed. You are not in any danger from us. Something released in Clara's shoulders. She let them inside. The cottage was small and warm, with the smell of clean linen and coal smoke. Clara sat across from them at her kitchen table with her hands clasped, and she told them, in a voice that remained almost steady throughout, the voice of a woman who had been rehearsing this moment for months without knowing when it would come, what had happened on the night of June the 14th. She had been summoned from the nursery at 8:30, not by Philip, not by Mrs. Graves, by a man she did not recognize, a servant she had never seen before at Ashford Park, who told her that the housekeeper required her assistance in the lower kitchens on an urgent matter. She had left the nursery. Edward had been sleeping, warm, fed, his small chest rising and falling with the peaceful certainty of a healthy child. She had gone to the lower kitchens. Mrs. Graves had not been there. The kitchen was empty. By the time she understood, she had been sent there under false pretenses and returned to the nursery. She stopped. Her clasped hands tightened until the knuckles went pale. What did you see when you returned? Roderic asked. Clara's eyes went to Evangeline. She looked at the mother when she said it, as though she had always known, if this moment came, that she needed to be looking at the right person. There was a man in the corridor, she said. Outside the nursery door, he was carrying something, a bundle, white blanket. Her voice dropped. He was coming out of the nursery. The kitchen held a silence so complete that Evangeline could hear the coal settling in the grate. He saw me. He told me that Lord Philip had instructed me to pack my belongings and leave the property before morning, that I had been found unsatisfactory, that a reference would be withheld if I spoke of what I had witnessed. Clara pressed her lips together. He gave me money. I took it because I was frightened, and I have not been able to live with that decision for a single day since. She looked at Evangeline with eyes that had been holding something for a very long time. The bundle was moving, she said. The words were very quiet. They were the loudest thing Evangeline had ever heard. Your Grace, Clara said. The bundle was moving. When he walked past me in the corridor, it moved. Evangeline stood. She did not know when she stood. Her body had done it without instruction, driven by something that lived beneath thought, beneath language, in the oldest and most animal part of her. Her legs were not entirely reliable. Roderic was beside her before she processed that he had moved. His hand was at her arm, steady, certain, immediate. Sit, he said, not a command. The specific quiet of a man trying to contain his own reaction so there was space enough for hers. She sat. She let him keep his hand on her arm for a moment, and she breathed, and the kitchen held its terrible, sacred silence around the three of them. They rode back to Ashford Park in near silence. Roderic did not fill it with words, and she was grateful for that in the way she was becoming grateful for everything about him that was exact, that was precise, that did not waste the air with sounds that served no purpose. They were halfway home when she said it. He is alive. Roderic's gaze moved to her. My son, she said. Her voice was very quiet and very certain. He did not die, Roderic. Someone took him. We don't yet. The bundle was moving. She was not crying. She was past crying. She was somewhere on the other side of it, in a place that was very cold and absolutely clear. A healthy living baby was carried from his nursery at night by a man sent by Philip, and a physician who left England the following month signed a death record, and the only witness was paid to disappear. She met Roderic's eyes. He is alive. Philip took him, and those payments to Yorkshire are how we find him. Roderic looked at her. She had seen many expressions on his face over 2 days. Controlled, precise, calculating, guarded. She had not yet seen what she saw now. A cold, absolute fury. Not the shouting kind. The kind that moved. The kind that did not stop. "We need more than Clara's account before we move," he said carefully. "Philip has enough influence to discredit her, deny everything, and remove you from the estate within days if we act before we have something he cannot answer." He held her gaze. "I need you to trust me, completely, for 24 more hours. Can you do that?" She looked at him. 6 months ago, she had not known his name. He had arrived at her door 48 hours ago as a stranger sent by a council to review paperwork, and yet there was not a single moment of hesitation in her. "Yes," she said. He held her gaze for a moment that lasted slightly longer than professional necessity required. Then he looked at the road ahead, and his jaw was set, and his hands were very still in his lap, and Evangeline thought in that carriage on that October afternoon that this man was the most dangerous person she had ever encountered, and that she had never, not once in her entire life, felt less afraid. That evening, a message arrived for Roderic. She was in the library when he found her, her candle burning low, Edmund's letters still spread on the desk in front of her, her hand pressed against the page as though she could feel her husband's presence through the paper. She looked up when Roderic entered. She knew by the way he moved. "The inn in Yorkshire has responded," he said, crossing directly to the desk. He spread the letter open between them. "A woman and a child have been in residence at the Kettlemore Inn since July. The woman identified herself as a widow from Derbyshire. The child is described as a boy, 3 to 4 months old upon arrival." He looked up. He arrived in July. He would be 10 months old, she said. The number sat in the air between them. 10 months. 7 months old when she had sat at a funeral and placed white roses over a casket she had never been allowed to open, because Philip had insisted it would be too much for her grief to bear to see the child again, and she had been too destroyed to fight him. She had never seen inside that casket. She had never seen inside that casket. The realization moved through her like ice water. "Roderic," her voice came out barely above a breath. "I never saw him at the funeral. Philip said it would be too painful, and I was not in a state to refuse him. I never saw. I know." His voice was very quiet. She looked at him. "You knew that already. I noted it in the estate records. There is no second witness to the identification of the deceased." He held her gaze. "Which is one of the irregularities that brought me here, Evangeline. The Crown's Counsel noticed it in the paperwork before they sent it to me." She stared at him. "They sent you because they already suspected. They sent me because the irregularities warranted investigation." He paused. "I came because I intended to find the truth." His eyes held hers steadily. "Those are different things." She absorbed that. Then, "We go to Yorkshire. Tomorrow morning," he said. "Before Philip is aware. I have authorization from the council. It arrived with the inn's response, and I have requested a constable from the Metropolitan Police to meet us there." He came around the desk until he stood in front of her, and his voice dropped to something very low and direct. "Evangeline, he has been with strangers, 7 months with people who are not you. Whatever you find when we walk into that room, I know," she said. "Do you?" She looked up at him. In the candlelight his face was very close, and all the careful control he wore was still in place. But she could see behind it now, the way you could see the structure of a building through fog. "He won't know my face," she said quietly. "He was 3 months old. He won't know my voice. He will be frightened of me, and I will need to be patient, and I do not care. I will spend the rest of my life being patient, if it means I am the one who gets to be patient with him." Her voice was steady. "I know what I am going into. I am not afraid of it." Roderic looked at her for a long, waited moment. Then he lifted his hand and touched her face. Not a caress, not a kiss. 2 fingers against her jaw, with the absolute deliberateness of a man who had been keeping his hands exactly where they belonged for 2 days and had now made a different decision. It lasted 3 seconds, 4, 5. His thumb moved barely, the lightest possible pressure against her cheekbone. Then he stepped back. "We ride at dawn," he said. His voice was rougher than it had been. He left the library. Evangeline stood in the candlelight with her hand rising to touch the place his fingers had been, and she understood, with the clarity of a woman who had spent 6 months in grief and was only now remembering what it felt like to be fully alive, that something had already been decided between them. Neither of them had said it. It did not need to be said. She did not sleep. She lay in her room and thought about Edward, not the Edward she had been grieving. The Edward she had believed lost, but the Edward who existed somewhere in Yorkshire, 10 months old, learning to sit up perhaps, or laughing at things the way babies laughed, or reaching for objects with the determined grip of a child who did not yet know his own name. She thought about Roderic's hand on her face. She thought about the look in his eyes when he stood in front of her, and the way he had said, "I came because I intended to find the truth," and the specific quality of the fury that had moved through him in Clara's kitchen when he understood what had been done. Not performed fury, not the strategic anger of a man managing a situation, the real kind. She was at the nursery door by 5 in the morning. She pressed her palm against the wood one last time. "Today," she said. Behind her, she heard his footsteps in the corridor. She knew it now, the specific rhythm of it, the deliberate pace, and she did not turn. But she heard him stop. And in the silence of the house before dawn, with her hand on the nursery door and Yorkshire waiting and Roderic standing at the end of the corridor, she felt the grief of 6 months begin. Not to leave, it would never entirely leave, but to make room for something else, for what came next. "Ready?" he said quietly. She took her hand from the door. "Yes," she said. The carriage left Ashford Park before the house had fully woken. No announcement, no breakfast, no word left for Philip beyond a brief note from Roderic to the estate office stating that the investigation required a site visit to a neighboring county. Vague enough to be true, specific enough to satisfy a cursory glance, and deliberately insufficient for anyone who needed more. Evangeline climbed into the carriage with a small traveling case and Edmund's letters folded inside her coat, against her heart. Roderic handed her in and sat across from her, and they moved through the iron-cold October morning in the particular silence of two people who have said enough, for now, and are conserving themselves for what comes next. The roads out of the county were empty at that hour, frost on the fields, rooks lifting from bare trees as they passed. England in October looked like it was preparing for something long and difficult, and Evangeline sat with her gloved hands in her lap and watched it and thought about her son waking up in a room in Yorkshire without knowing she was coming. "How long?" she asked. 5 hours if the roads are clear. Roderic was reading in his ledger, not the way men read to avoid conversation. She had learned his silences well enough to distinguish between them. He was working. The constable should arrive at the inn by midday. He traveled overnight from Leeds. She nodded. The carriage rocked steadily. The frost on the hedgerows caught the first thin light and turned silver. "How did you know?" she said. Roderic looked up. "The first morning," she said. "In the garden. You asked about Edward before you had any reason to ask about Edward. You came to me before you had reviewed the accounts that would have told you to." She looked at him steadily. "You already suspected something before you arrived at Ashford Park." He closed the ledger. "The death record," he said, "was flagged in London before the council formally requested an investigation. A junior clerk at the Crown Registry noticed the physician's name in both the infant's death record and the father's. Same physician, 2 deaths, 2 months apart, same estate." He paused. "The clerk was new. Senior clerks had been passing the file between them for months without escalating it. He didn't know he wasn't supposed to notice. And they sent you. They sent me because it required someone Philip could not persuade to look away." Something moved in his expression. "I have been sent to several estates for that reason. Men with significant influence tend to believe they can manage an investigation the way they manage everything else. The choice of investigator is chosen specifically to disabuse them of that belief." She looked at him. "And me? When did you decide to tell me?" He held her gaze for a long moment. "In the garden," he said, "when you didn't flinch." "At what?" "At the question about your son. Most people in your position would have deflected, would have become emotional or defended themselves from the implied intrusion or asked what I meant by raising it." His voice was very even. "You looked at me and said yes. And then you asked if I was sorry with the particular tone of a woman who has been given so many performances of sympathy that she can no longer tolerate another one. The corner of his mouth moved. I decided then. She looked at him across the rocking carriage. That I could be trusted, she said. That you had already been doing this alone for 6 months, he said, and that was 6 months too long. The road curved. The first pale sunlight broke through the clouds and crossed the carriage floor between them, and Evangeline thought about 6 months of sitting at her desk in the dark writing things down, for an audience of no one. "Thank you," she said. He looked at her with that expression she was beginning to know, the one that lived just behind the controlled surface, that moved like something in deep water. "Don't thank me until we have him," he said, and his voice this time was not the measured, professional voice. It was something lower than that. She turned to the window so he would not see what was happening to her face. They stopped once, briefly, at a posting house near the county line to change horses and take coffee. Evangeline stood outside in the cold while the horses were changed, her hands wrapped around the cup, and Roderic came to stand beside her without being asked. Not close enough to suggest anything. Simply there, the way he was always simply there, occupying the exact amount of space required by the situation, never more, never less. "When I was 8 years old," she said, not entirely sure why she was saying it, "my mother told me that the most dangerous thing a woman of our class could do was to be seen wanting something too much." She sipped her coffee. "That desire was a vulnerability, that it made you legible to people who would use it." Roderic was quiet for a moment. "Your mother was not wrong," he said. "About the danger, no. She looked at the road ahead, but she was wrong about the solution. She thought the answer was not wanting. I think—" She stopped. "You think?" he said. "I think the answer is choosing what you want clearly enough that no one else can choose it for you." She turned to look at him, the way Edmund did in those letters. He was frightened and he knew the danger, and he documented everything anyway, because he had decided what mattered. Roderic looked at her for a moment. "Yes," he said quietly. "That is precisely it." Something passed between them. Not a touch, not a word, but the specific warmth of two people understanding each other, without the trouble of explanation. The horses were ready. They got back in the carriage and continued north. The Kettlemore Inn sat at the edge of a small Yorkshire market town, 3 stories of sandstone and black timber, with a courtyard that smelled of horses and coal smoke. It was a respectable establishment, not grand, not shabby, the kind of place where people lived quietly for extended periods without attracting particular notice. Constable Aldous Price was already waiting in the courtyard when they arrived. He was a solidly built man in his late 30s, with the kind of face that had been in difficult rooms before and had learned not to register surprise. He nodded to Roderic with the professional recognition of 2 people who had worked together before. "Your Grace." He glanced at Evangeline with careful neutrality. "My lady." "What do we know?" Roderic asked. "The woman is Mrs. Halley, 42, widow, no prior record of any kind. She arrived here with the child in early July, settled her account monthly without incident. The innkeeper describes her as quiet, careful, devoted to the child." Price paused. "She has not attempted to leave at any point, has not contacted anyone locally, has not by all accounts been anything other than exactly what she appears, a woman caring for a child." "A woman paid to care for a child," Roderic said. "Yes. Has she been told we are coming?" "No. I arrived an hour ago and have been waiting. The innkeeper knows only that there is a matter of estate administration requiring an interview." Roderic looked at Evangeline. She had been listening to this exchange with her hands clasped in front of her, and her face arranged in the careful composure she had spent 6 months perfecting. But her eyes, he had learned to read her eyes, were doing something that was not composure at all. "She may be frightened when she sees me," Evangeline said quietly. "She will know who I am." "Yes," Roderic said. "She will. Don't let that frighten her into silence. It won't." He said it with absolute certainty. "I'll speak with her first, alone, establish the parameters, and then you come in." She nodded. He looked at her for one more moment, a look that carried more than it was permitted to say in a coaching inn courtyard with a constable 3 feet away, and then he walked inside. The wait was 14 minutes. Evangeline stood in the courtyard and counted each one. Constable Price made an attempt at conversation about the road conditions that she answered with enough courtesy to be polite, and enough brevity to make clear she was not available for conversation. He did not attempt a second topic, When the door opened and Roderic appeared on the threshold, he did not say anything. He simply held the door and looked at her. She walked inside. The room at the end of the first corridor was small and warm, with a low fire and a window overlooking the courtyard garden. A woman, Mrs. Halley, plain-faced, dark-eyed, with the steadiness of someone who had made a decision and was prepared to live by it, sat in the chair by the window. On the rug, surrounded by wooden blocks that had been stacked and knocked down and stacked again in the industrious cycle of a child discovering the pleasure of destruction, was a boy. He had Edmund's dark hair. He had Evangeline's eyes. He was sitting upright with the triumphant solidity of a child who has recently mastered this particular skill, and he was looking at the wooden blocks with absolute concentration, and he was entirely, completely, incontrovertibly alive. Evangeline stopped in the doorway. She had known. She had known since Clara's kitchen, since the carriage ride home, since the first moment the thought had formed with the force of something too fundamental to be a theory. She had known. But knowing and seeing were different countries. She put her hand against the doorframe. The boy looked up. He looked at her with the open, evaluating gaze of a 10-month-old encountering a stranger. No recognition, no memory, no framework for this woman standing in his doorway. And then, after a moment that lasted the rest of Evangeline's life, he held up a wooden block, offering it to her, the way babies offered things, because she was there, because she was a person and he was a person, and that was enough. Evangeline sat down on the floor, right there in the doorway, on the stone floor of a Yorkshire inn, in her traveling coat with Edmund's letters against her heart. She sat down on the floor and held out her hand. He considered her hand. He considered the block. He placed the block in her palm with the gravity of a child making a significant decision. Evangeline closed her fingers around it. She looked at her son's face, and her son looked at her hand, and the fire crackled and the room was very warm, and she did not make a sound. She was past sounds, past the vocabulary of this, past everything that language could do with a moment this particular. But she felt Roderic behind her in the doorway, not touching her, not speaking, just there, the way he was always there. Mrs. Halley spoke for nearly an hour. She had been approached, she explained, by a solicitor's clerk in late June, a week after the infant had been brought to her. The arrangement was simple. Care for the child, maintain complete discretion, accept monthly payment, and wait for further instruction regarding the child's future placement. She had been told the child was an orphan from a family matter that required a period of private resolution. She had been told nothing else. She had suspected, from the child's obvious quality, the fine wool of his clothing, the silverwork on his initial locket, that this was not quite the ordinary family arrangement she had been presented with. But the child was healthy and loving, and she had asked no further questions. "There is something else," Roderic said. His voice, Evangeline noted, was very controlled. Mrs. Halley looked at her hands. 4 months ago, she said, August, I received a second payment from a different solicitor, Mr. Whitmore of Gray's Inn. She looked up. He sent a letter with it. He said that he represented the interests of a gentleman who wished to ensure the child's welfare and safety, and who was unable to act directly at present, but who intended to do so as soon as it was possible. She paused. He asked me to continue caring for the child and to make no contact with anyone associated with the Ashford estate. The room went very still. Evangeline's hand, which had been resting on Edward's back as he leaned against her, engaged in the complex business of examining her coat button, stopped moving. "Whitmore," she said. Roderic looked at her. Whitmore, the name from Edmund's letters. The solicitor Edmund had been corresponding with in the weeks before his death. The man Edmund had been writing to about the irregularities in the succession. The man he had intended to visit in London on Thursday. The Thursday he never reached. Edmund knew, she said. Her voice came out very quiet. Edmund found out, before he died. He found out that Edward was alive and he was trying. She stopped. The coat button slipped from Edward's grip and he made a sound of mild protest and reached for it again, and she let him take it. He was trying to protect him. He sent money to keep him safe. Her throat worked. And Philip killed him before he could do anything more. The room was absolutely silent except for the fire and the small industrious sounds of a child. "Mr. Whitmore," Roderic said carefully, "we'll have Edmund's correspondence, Edmund's own account of what he knew and when." He looked at Evangeline steadily. "That is the evidence we have been missing. That is what makes this complete." Complete. She understood what he meant. Not just the physical existence of her living son. Not just the testimonies of Clara Voss and Mrs. Halley. Not just the altered death record and the departed physician and the payments to Yorkshire. But Edmund's own words, Edmund's own evidence, gathered in the weeks before his death, now sitting in a solicitor's office in London like a letter addressed to the future. She looked down at her son, who had given up on the coat button and was now methodically placing his palm against the floor and lifting it, fascinated by the sound it made. Edmund protected him, she said. Even when he thought Edward had died, he was suspicious, he was investigating. And then he found out the truth, and he spent the last weeks of his life trying to get to him. She pressed her lips together. He died trying. The silence held. Then Edward looked up at her face and made a sound, a small, declarative syllable with no particular meaning except the announcement of his own continued existence, and slapped his palm against the floor again with considerable satisfaction. Evangeline laughed. It came out of her without permission, broken at the edges, wet with everything she had been not crying for 6 months. But it was a laugh. It was real. It was the first real laugh she had produced since June. Across the room, she heard Roderic exhale. When she looked up at him, his expression was the most open she had ever seen. He was not looking at the child. He was looking at her. The confrontation came sooner than expected. They had been at the inn for 2 hours. Constable Price was taking Mrs. Halley's formal statement in the adjoining room. Roderic had dispatched an urgent letter to Mr. Whitmore in London by the inn's own courier. Evangeline was on the floor with Edward, who had accepted her with the magnificent pragmatism of a 10-month-old who had decided she was an interesting new feature of his world. It was Roderic who heard the carriage first. He was at the window. He had been at the window for the past 30 minutes, in the particular stance of a man watching a road he did not want anyone to come down, and she heard him say, very quietly, one word. "Philip." Evangeline looked up. Roderic turned from the window with a controlled, absolute calm that was more frightening than fury would have been. "Take the child to the far room," he said. "Stay with Mrs. Halley. Do not come out until I come for you." "Roderic, Evangeline." He crossed the room and crouched in front of her, and for a moment they were level, eye to eye, and his voice was very quiet and very certain. "I need you somewhere that is not between Philip and this door, not because you cannot handle him, because I am going to handle him, and I need to know you are safe while I do it." She looked at him. Then she picked up her son. Edward made a sound of surprise and grabbed her collar with both hands, and she went into the far room. She heard Philip's voice first. It was his public voice, the one that had never lost its veneer of reasonableness, that had carried 6 months of subtle cruelties wrapped in the language of concern. She heard it from the other side of the door, and her jaw tightened. Then she heard Roderic's voice. She had heard Roderic speak in many registers over 3 days, precise, quiet, direct, and occasionally warm in the specific way of a man who had learned to ration warmth carefully. She had not yet heard this. This was something different. This was the voice of a man who was not managing the situation. This was the voice that had made 4 English lords resign their titles. She pressed close to the door and listened. "You have no authority here," Philip was saying. "This investigation was an audit of estate records, not whatever you believe you are doing. Whatever lies this woman has told you, Lord Ashford." Roderic's voice was absolutely level. "You will lower your voice. There is a child in this building." "That child," Philip said, "is an orphan under my ward's care. There is nothing more to be said about—" "The child," Roderic said, "is Edward Edmund Ashford, heir to the Ashford estate, son of the late Duke Edmund Ashford and his Duchess Evangeline Ashford. He is alive and in the care of his mother. You arranged his removal from Ashford Park on the night of June the 14th. You paid Dr. Harland to falsify the death record. You paid Clara Voss to vacate the nursery. And when the late Duke Ashford discovered that his son was alive and began gathering evidence to present to the Crown's Council, you arranged for his death before he could reach London." The silence was very long. "You cannot prove any of— I have the sworn testimony of Clara Voss," Roderic continued in the same level voice, "identifying you as the source of the instructions given to the man who removed the child from the nursery. I have a state account record showing payments to Dr. Harland and to this inn. I have Edmund Ashford's own letters documenting his suspicions and his discovery that his son was alive. And I have a solicitor in London who has been in correspondence with Edmund Ashford for the weeks preceding his death and who is, at this moment, presenting that correspondence to the Crown's Council." He paused. "I also have a constable who has just finished taking Mrs. Halley's formal statement in the room next door." Another silence. Then Philip's voice, stripped of its veneer. "You have overstepped." "No." Roderic's voice did not rise. "You overstepped, Lord Ashford, repeatedly, in ways that cost a man his life, removed a child from his mother for 7 months, and reduced one of the most capable women I have encountered in 40 years of life to 6 months of unnecessary grief." Something moved in his voice, something that was not professional at all. "You will step back from the door. Constable Price will accompany you while your formal statement is taken. You will make no attempt to leave this building. And if you raise your voice again in a building where that child is present, we will have a considerably less comfortable conversation." A chair scraped, footsteps, the constable's voice, brisk and official, directing Philip toward a seat. And then Roderic's voice, lower now, closer to the door she was standing behind. "Evangeline." She opened the door. He was standing on the other side of it, and they were separated by 6 inches of October air, and Edward had both fists in her hair, and was pulling with the cheerful determination of a child who had discovered a new game, and the look on Roderic's face when he saw her. She would keep that look. She would keep it somewhere that did not have a name. "Is it done?" she said. "Nearly." He looked at her, and then at the small person currently reorganizing her coiffure, and something crossed his face that was not professional, and was not controlled, and was not anything she had a word for yet. "It is done." The next several hours were the structured chaos of the legal process. Price completed Philip's formal statement with the methodical efficiency of a man who had done this many times, and found it deeply satisfying when the evidence was this complete. Roderic produced his documentation with the precision of someone who had organized it for exactly this presentation. A second constable arrived from the town shortly after, called by Price on his arrival. Philip, stripped of his veneer and his certainty, was a smaller man than he had appeared at Ashford Park. He attempted, twice, to make the kind of statement that was designed to suggest Roderic had exceeded his mandate, that the investigation had been improperly conducted, that the evidence had been gathered without proper authority. Both times, Roderic produced the precise document that answered the precise objection without apparent surprise, as though he had known exactly which arguments would be made and had prepared for each one with the patient thoroughness of a man who did not lose. It was, Evangeline thought, watching from the corner where she sat with Edward in her lap, the most impressive thing she had ever seen. Edward had fallen asleep against her shoulder at some point during the second hour, with the absolute unconscious trust of a child who had decided the person holding him was safe. She sat very still so as not to wake him. Roderic, passing between the rooms on some errand of documentation, paused when he saw her. He paused for just a moment. At the doorway, in transit, with papers in his hand and the efficient purpose of the legal process clearly in motion around him. He looked at her with the sleeping child against her shoulder. Something moved across his face, swift and unguarded, and then he was gone again. Philip was removed from the inn at 4 o'clock that afternoon. He walked out between the two constables with his coat collar turned up and his eyes forward, and he did not look at Evangeline. She did not watch him go. She was at the courtyard window with Edward propped against her hip, and she was showing him the horses in the yard. He was transfixed by them, mouth slightly open in the particular awe of a child encountering something large and moving. And she heard the carriage door close and the wheels begin to move, and she felt something that had been coiled in her chest for 6 months begin, very slowly, to release. "He will face formal charges in London," Roderic said from behind her. "The council has been waiting for evidence sufficient to act. They have more than sufficient now." She turned. He was standing in the middle of the room with his coat properly on now, the papers put away, the controlled professional order he wore restored around him. He looked, from the outside, like a man who had completed an investigation. But he was looking at her like a man who was not thinking about investigations at all. "What happens now?" she said. "You return to Ashford Park as its rightful Duchess," he said. "With the rightful heir, the succession reverts. The council will manage the formal process, but the outcome is not in question." He paused. "Edmund's letters, combined with Whitmore's correspondence, will also formally establish the cause of Edmund's death. There will be a full inquiry." She nodded. "And you?" she said. He looked at her. "I completed my report," he said carefully. "File my findings with the council." And he stopped. "And," she said. The room was very quiet. Edward made a small sound against her shoulder and resettled, still sleeping, with the boneless comfort of exhausted infancy. "And the investigation," Roderic said, "concludes." She understood what he was not saying. The investigation concluded, and with it, his official reason for being in her life, his mandate, his structured, legitimate presence in her house and her days and her... She looked at him. "That is not what I was asking," she said quietly. "I ask what you will do, not the investigation." His jaw moved. "Evangeline, you have spent 3 days moving through my life with the complete certainty of a man who knew exactly where he was going and why." She held his gaze steadily. "I would like to know if there is a version of that certainty that extends past the filing of a report." Silence. He looked at her with those gray eyes that she had, in 3 days, learned to read the way she read rooms, the architecture of him, the specific light behind the controlled surface. "The things I feel," he said, slowly and very carefully, "regarding you are not things I can discuss while I am still formally your investigator. The investigation," she said, "is concluded. You said so yourself." Something moved in his expression. It would be... He stopped, started again. "You have been through something that would require... Roderic." Her voice was very quiet. "I have had 6 months of grief and 2 days of the clearest thinking of my life. I know my own mind." He looked at her. "I know," he said, and his voice had gone rough. "I know you do. That is what terrifies me." She stared at him. "I terrify you? The way you look at things terrifies me." He moved, 1 step, controlled, deliberate. "The way you looked at Clara Voss's door before you knocked. The way you sat on the floor of a Yorkshire inn and held out your hand to a child who didn't know you. The way you sat in that carriage for 5 hours and didn't ask me to make it smaller than it was." Another step. "You terrify me because I have spent 34 years making sure nothing and no one had that degree of access to me, and you managed it in 3 days without appearing to try." She was very still. He was close now. The closest he had been except for the library. Except for 2 fingers against her jaw in the candlelight that had traveled through her like a struck note. "You complete investigations," she said. "Yes. And then you leave." "Yes." His voice was very rough now. "That is what I do. Is that what you want to do?" The question fell between them with the weight of everything they had not said in 3 days. His hand came up and rested at her jaw, fuller this time, his whole hand, cupping the side of her face with a careful, absolute tenderness that was entirely different from the professional certainty he wore everywhere else. "No," he said. She looked up at him. "No," he said again, quieter. "It is not." "Then don't," she said simply. He looked at her for a long moment, her face, and then the sleeping child against her shoulder, and then her face again. And then he kissed her, gently, briefly, with the specific reverence of a man kissing something he has decided to keep. She leaned into it, and Edward slept on, and the horses moved in the courtyard outside, and the October light came through the window at its low autumn angle, and made everything in the room look warm and permanent. When they parted, his forehead rested against hers. "I have a house in Derbyshire," he said, very quietly. "It has been empty for 4 years." He paused. "It has a garden, does it? And a library that is considerably better stocked than the one at Ashford Park." His thumb moved along her cheekbone. "I thought you might want to know that." She laughed, softly, so as not to wake Edward. "I thought you were not in the habit of offering false information," she said. "I am not offering false information." The corner of his mouth curved. "I am offering a house in Derbyshire." She looked at him. "Give me time," she said quietly, "to bring him home, to let Edmund's name be properly restored, to let Ashford Park breathe again." She held his gaze. "And then ask me properly." He looked at her with something in his eyes that had no name she currently possessed. "I intend to," he said. They returned to Ashford Park 2 days later. The journey south was entirely different from the journey north. Edward sat in Evangeline's lap and watched the countryside with the consuming interest of a child for whom everything was new. And Roderic sat across from them and watched Edward with the particular expression of a man pretending he was not doing what he was doing. "He has your eyes," Roderic said at one point, apparently addressing the window. "He has my eyes and Edmund's stubbornness," Evangeline said. "He has been trying to take my glove off for 40 minutes. "He will succeed," Roderic said. "He has your determination." She looked at him. He was still looking at the window, and the corner of his mouth was doing something specific that she was beginning to love. The manor was very still when the carriage rolled up the drive. Mrs. Graves was standing on the front steps. When the carriage door opened and Evangeline stepped down with Edward in her arms, the housekeeper went quite still for a moment, and then something moved across her face, relief recognition, the specific expression of a woman who had known something was wrong for 6 months and had not had a way to say so. She curtsied deeply. "Your Grace, Mrs. Graves." Evangeline held her son and stood on the steps of her own home. "Please have the nursery fire lit. It has been cold for too long." "Yes, my lady," Mrs. Graves said, quietly, with everything she did not say arranged in the steadiness of her voice. The estate was hers. The heir was home. The weeks that followed were the particularly busy chaos of a life being reconstructed. The formal inquiry into Edmund's death proceeded in London with Whitmore's correspondence. At its center, Edmund's letters, his own evidence, his documentation of what he had suspected and then discovered. They were presented to the council with the completeness of a man who had anticipated not surviving to present them himself, and had written accordingly. Philip faced formal charges. The proceedings were swift by the standards of the Crown's legal process, because the evidence was thorough, and because a duke had assembled it, and because the King's Council had been waiting for precisely this kind of resolution. The Ashford estate returned formally to Evangeline's management, held in trust for Edward until his majority. The succession was confirmed. The falsified death record was struck from the official register and replaced with the correct documentation. Dr. Harland was located in Edinburgh and returned to England to face the consequences of his testimony. The Coaching Inn in Yorkshire sent Mrs. Halley's final account. Evangeline paid it personally and wrote a letter of thanks that was, she thought, completely inadequate to what Mrs. Halley had done. Kept her son warm and fed and safe for 7 months without being asked to and without being thanked for it. Mrs. Halley wrote back, briefly. She said only that the child had been very good company, and that she was glad to know he was where he belonged. Evangeline kept the letter. Roderic came back. He had said he would, in the way he said things, without ornament, without qualification. He had filed his report with the council, completed his formal obligations, and had then gotten in his carriage and come back to Ashford Park. He did not bring documentation this time. He came on a Thursday evening in November, when the first real cold of autumn had settled over the county and the estate fires were all burning, and Evangeline was in the library with Edward on the rug building, an extremely ambitious tower out of books that were not designed for this purpose. The tower fell when Roderic knocked at the library door. Edward looked at the fallen books with profound philosophical patience. Then he looked at the door. Then he looked at Roderic when Roderic entered. Roderic looked at the child. Edward held up a book. Roderic crossed the room and sat down on the floor, in his coat, in his perfectly pressed coat, and accepted the book. "This one is upside down," he observed. "He is not yet reading," Evangeline said. "He is structurally oriented. The orientation of the text is a secondary concern." He placed the book carefully at the base of a new tower formation. "There, better load distribution." Edward approved this immediately and placed a second book on top. Evangeline watched them. She thought about what it meant for a man like Roderic Vossler, a man who had spent his life in the exact, controlled, solitary work of finding the truth in other people's disasters. To sit down on a library floor and build a book tower with a 10-month-old. She thought about what it meant that he did it without being asked, without making it significant, without looking at her to check if it was the right thing. He simply did it because the child had offered him a book. "You said," she began. "Yes," he said, to ask properly. "Yes." He looked up at her. She looked back at him. "There is an abundance of libraries in Derbyshire," she said. "You mentioned it." "I did. And a garden. A significant one. Edward will need a garden." Roderic set down the book in his hand very carefully. "He will. And She stopped. "And you?" he said. She looked at him across the library floor, across the scattered books and the small person between them and the fire and the November dark outside the window. "I need someone who looks for what is buried," she said, "and then stays." Roderic held her gaze for a moment that belonged entirely to them, not to the investigation, not to the council, not to the months of grief, or the legal proceedings, or the carefully reconstructed world, just to them. Then he said, "Marry me," not a question, not a petition, the quiet declaration of a man who had decided and was not interested in equivocation. She looked at him, at his gray eyes and his coat covered in book dust, and Edward, who had used this moment to place a very small volume directly on top of Roderic's head with considerable satisfaction. She laughed, again, the real kind, the kind that came from somewhere that had been shut for a long time and was open now. "Yes," she said. They were married in February, a small ceremony at the parish church in the Ashford village. with the particular economy of two people who had already been through enough spectacle and preferred quiet truth to grand performance. Mrs. Graves cried, discreetly, into her handkerchief in the third pew. Constable Price sent a letter of congratulations from London that was much warmer in tone than anything in his professional manner had suggested he was capable of. Whitmore attended and was deeply satisfied by the entire situation. Edward, present in the arms of Mrs. Halley, who had been invited, because how could she not be, was primarily interested in the flowers on the altar and made several declarative statements about them in the language of a child who has not yet acquired words, but has excellent opinions. Roderic stood at the altar and watched Evangeline walk toward him. She wore pale blue, no veil. Her eyes were clear and direct and exactly as they had been that first afternoon on the garden bench, the eyes of a woman who did not flinch from what was true. He had never, in his life, been grateful for an estate audit. He was grateful for this one. Spring came to Ashford Park the way spring came everywhere. Not all at once, but in increments, in small victories of warmth over cold, light over dark, new green over the gray-brown of a long winter. Evangeline sat on the bench beside the old oak with Edward in her lap, letting him examine the first crocus she had picked from the garden. He was holding it with enormous concentration, turning it slowly, processing its yellowness and its fragility and its smell. Roderic sat beside her, not at the professional distance he had maintained that first October afternoon. Beside her, his arm warm against hers, his shoulder where her shoulder was, close enough that Edward periodically reconsidered the crocus in favor of investigating Roderic's coat pocket, which had proven, over the past several months, to contain reliably interesting things. "He's walking," Evangeline said. "He fell 4 times this morning. He got up 4 times. Roderic looked at their son. Their son, the word was not complicated. It had simply become true. And the expression on his face was the same one she had seen in Yorkshire, in that warm inn-room, when she had looked up from the floor with Edward in her lap and found him watching her. It was not an expression he had worn much of in the first 34 years of his life. He was learning. "Tell me something," she said. "Anything." "When you arrived at Ashford Park in October," she said, "what did you expect to find?" He thought about it, genuinely considered it, the way he considered everything. "An irregularity in succession documentation," he said. "A mid-level financial fraud, a straightforward application of modest legal remedies. And instead you found everything else," he said. She turned to look at him. "Are you sorry?" He looked at her. At the crocus still turning in his son's fist. At the oak tree in the garden and the manor beyond it, warm now, lived in again, full of the particular sound of a house that had a child in it. "No," he said. She leaned into him. Above them, the March light came through the oak's first new leaves, thin, pale. The very first green of the year, and Edward made a sound of pure satisfaction at the crocus, and then tried to eat it, and Roderic removed it from his grasp with the calm efficiency that had, over 4 months, become his father's most used skill. And in the nursery at the top of the house, the fire burned, not cold now, not ever cold again. If this story moves something in you, if you stayed until the very last ember, then you already know what this channel is about. Love that refuses to stay buried, truth that refuses to stay silent, and the kind of devotion that crosses counties, dismantles men of power, and sits down on library floors. Welcome, or welcome back, to the Royal Duke Diaries, where every story is a world, and every world is worth staying for. Subscribe, share this with someone who needs a love story today, and come back, because the next story is already waiting for you, and it begins where this one ends, in the quiet after the impossible, where everything that matters finally has room to breathe. With love, the Royal Duke Diaries.